Sounds great. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's always nice to be with this group. It's far and away one of the highlights for me every month. And so, Monica, do you want to go to the next slide, because I think that sort of tees it up, and I didn't know if either Jody or the commissioner wanted to say any words. I'm happy to talk about it, but I think the next slide is the spheres of racialization, if I remember.
It is, and Commish, I know you can do this off the top of your head, but we'd love to hear you talk about this slide if you're
able. Yeah,
I absolutely can. You know, you'll see the illustration pretty soon, and it's you're no stranger to it because we've used it quite a bit. And I'm very much a systems thinker, and this is a way to kind of really think about systemic racialization through that lens of the concentric circles and a holarchy, which means that the individual is at the center, and that we come to this racial justice work with our own identity and our own individual development. The second layer is that kind of interpersonal layer in which our racial identity comes out as we interact with other people, their racial identity. So think about the racial identities of your staff as they interact with our families, as they interact with our providers. Think about the racial identity of the provider partners as they are giving the services to our families. And then think about those interactions as you think about that second circle. That's that interpersonal level. That's where the implicit bias stuff starts to rear its head as people interpersonally connect with each other. The institutional layer is the layer that we've talked about that represents who we are as an institution. So child welfare is an institution, law enforcement's an institution, education and school systems are kind of that institutional layer. And when you think about things like the achievement gap or disparity and disproportionality in our outcomes, that's what we're trying to influence in any of the critical looks at our practice and policy. That's that institutional layer. The next layer is the structural layer, which is the cumulative effect of all of that we all live in the context of our environment. And so it's that reciprocal relationship related to race that we have with our environment and that our environment has on us. You think about public policy, you think about the history, you think about the ways in which racial groups interact with each other as a result of that historic context. So you can't take the internal and what people are feeling inside and extrapolate from the whole societal influence on race and history, particularly in America as it relates to the evolution of race relations between systems and in the context of the broader culture. And so I always ground myself in this spherical approach because I do think as a system, people get hung up sometimes in that little internal piece and don't recognize or take the time to recognize that it's people who make up our systems, who make up our day-to-day decision-making in every aspect of the work, not just our caseload carrying staff, everybody across the board. So when we set forth to set the charge for our senior leaders, we didn't give anybody a pass. Everybody comes to the table with those biases and your own racial identity, and how we drive outcomes for this department is led by that. And so I hope that's what you needed to kind of tee us off in terms of setting the stage for this discussion, Jen, but that's how I always view this particular illustration and this model.
So I love listening to you do that, Commissioner, because every time I hear you, I take more notes because something else clicks for me. And so first of all, thank you. And I'm gonna, Monica, if we can keep this slide up for one more second, because there were three things that I think, at least in my mind, are a perfect lead into the history based on what the Commissioner just described. The first is what a parallel process this is for our work with children and families. And even as we think about, I'll say historically, right, when we think about quote unquote saving the children, as I'll talk about in a second about our history, right, is how do you quote unquote save a child without focusing on the family who lives in the context of a community, right? And what a very Eurocentric, individually driven, white European dominant frame it is to only think about an individual outside of a larger context. So that's point one, and the parallels to me are very striking. The second is sort of the little cliche that we say a lot in organizational transformation work, which is that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I say that because as I'm looking at all the people going to implicit bias training and thinking about train the trainer, and then we're going to talk later about how we can't change everybody's hearts and minds. And I point this out because there is some evidence that's being bantered about, I don't know if anyone's seen it, about people being super concerned that implicit bias training isn't having a whole lot of effect on changing outcomes, not just in child welfare, but very broadly. And part of what we're seeing in terms of implementation science in that is that because implicit bias training is happening outside of a culture that supports the broader shifts. And so if all we do is spend all of our time in the agency focused on internalized and interpersonal circles and don't do anything to shift the cultures in our institutions and in our structures, the implicit bias training runs a risk of not being very effective by itself. But in Connecticut at DCF, it's not intended to function by itself. And so it's a piece of a bigger whole. And so part of this conversation, even around the history, is around how do we shift the culture and make sure that our culture is one that supports those kinds of trainings and the behavior shifts, more importantly, that we're using those trainings to accomplish. The third thing I'll say, and then I'll actually talk a little about history, is that when I think about, and when I first saw this slide, the spheres of systemic racialization, it made me immediately think about spheres of influence. Because what I think we all have to recognize, and part of why I think this group has always been so powerful, is because we actually all have leadership and ownership and influence over every one of these circles. And if we put those together and not just focus on the, what can I do for myself, but really what can I do within the institution? What can I do within my unit? I'll start within my unit or my team. What can I do within this agency? And what can I do in the broader structures? And if I think about the spheres of systemic racialization at the same time I'm thinking about my spheres of influence, I think it's a really helpful construct to make sure that you all realize that every one of us thinks about the fact that we have agency in every single one of these circles that we have to own and step into and affect. So, Commissioner, your opening remarks I'll bring back, which are, when we think about trying to sustain this urgency and this momentum over time, my thinking is that now is the time that we cannot take our foot off the gas. And in fact, right now we should actually be pushing down just a little bit more and really thinking, even through the history and then through even the change initiatives, where do you have influence? Whether it's responsibility, authority, or just influence, and there's no just, in each one of these circles, so that we can continue pushing this in a very, very, very urgent way. So I don't know if you want to comment on that, Commissioner, before I turn to history.
Absolutely right, Jen. I think that, in order to kind of move the needle on the institutional, you have to be cognizant and present in all of the layers. But our role in our professional function is to move outcomes at the institutional level. So, kind of recognizing all of these in the context of each other and their reciprocal relationships are paramount if we're going to really move the needles.
Yeah, great. So, I'm now going to race through about 100+ years of history, but this is now the child welfare context, because we've talked a lot over the last 7 years or so. We've talked about all different kinds of structural and systemic racism in a lot of different sectors. But I think we realized more recently that we've never really done with this group the deep dive about child welfare very specifically. And so, in thinking about our origins, right, we always use the language, every system is perfectly designed to achieve exactly the results that it gets, which means we have to really understand what our system was designed to do to really match it up to say, we shouldn't be surprised right now that we have very dramatic disparities and a lot to undo. So, we think about the fact that, first of all, the history of child welfare was actually to save children, very specifically white children. When it came time to start focusing on Indigenous and people of color, Black families and brown families, it was all about separation. There was no intention ever to support families, but it was really about dividing families, pulling children away. Every pretty much policy has been designed using these Eurocentric designs and a dominant frame of white supremacy, which means individually focused. And when it's focused on family, it is typically focused on what's considered the white Eurocentric nuclear family, not a broader context for family. And it's an industry, right? And people hear this all the time with the incarceration system. But really, child welfare isn't that much different if you think about it. If we think for a moment, just pause, think about funding for foster care, for out-of-home placements, and compare that to allocated funding for keeping families together. Right there, we can see what we're prioritizing as a system is we are prioritizing family separation. So that's just the broad brush. I now just want to walk through a couple some key points and then bring us up to the future with policy and legislation. Can you move ahead, Monica? So we start, and I said I was going to really do this fast, right? 150 years we're going to move through, but we're going to start with some of the ones that people know. People have heard about the orphan trains, Children's Aid Society. People know the story of Mary Ellen in New York City, who, white immigrant girl. I say all this because this was really the time where white, poor immigrant children, most of them at that time in the 1800s were homeless, being removed from the streets in cities, primarily cities in the Northeast, shipped off to farms in the Midwest to do farming work, essentially to be free migrant labor under the guise of adoption, although it wasn't termed that. But again, that was white European immigrants at that time. This whole process had no regard whatsoever for Black, Brown, or Native children or families. The Children's Bureau, you look, was created early 1900s. And originally it was really just about funding for single mothers. It really had nothing to do with children, but it was white mothers. And Social Security was created in 1935 with Title 4B. And that was, again, it was around white single mothers. We actually hadn't really entered into a world. And that was, for a lot of structural reasons, mainly because of all of the other legislation that kept a very separate system for Blacks up until that point. Then we see, and I think this is so interesting, not in a good way, but in 1960, right, it's the first time we see federal funds for foster care. And everyone just take a moment and think about the 60s, right? And if I were to ask a question in a big room and say, when I say the 1960s, what jumps to your mind that was happening in this country, right? Civil rights movement, right? And look what happens to child welfare at the same time that the civil rights movement is happening. And so what we now have a picture of in the 1960s is that as there is this great mobilization around this country of Blacks seeking justice and freedom and equity, at that point equality, our government responds by saying, okay, and we're going to start separating families, right? And we're going to pay for it, right? We're willing to put money to pay for family separation. And just guess who gets to come into the foster care system at this time? Black families. So now we're starting to see the underpinnings of our child welfare. I'm now going to fast forward, and on the next slide, I'm going to take you through some of the key legislation that many of you in child welfare are super familiar with, and many of you could probably do this part even better than I can. But I want to point out for each one of these pieces of legislation, the implications of what it meant for children and families of color and Native children in this country, right? Key legislation that did precisely what it was designed to do. 1974, right? Child Abuse Prevention Treatment Act, right? We suddenly dump a huge amount of money in the early 70s, right? Not into family support, child abuse prevention, right? So now we're talking about child abuse, right? And all of a sudden, we're starting to see these trends around poverty, and we're starting to see, particularly in urban centers, and now the federal government is willing, for one of the first times, to put money into child abuse, okay? The Native communities actually realized this much earlier, I think, than many, and realized probably about 4 years later what that meant for their kids. And they basically said, whoa, we're sovereign nations. You can't do this to us. You can't take our kids away from us as sovereign nations. So ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act, came and was actually a decent model, some would say, because it basically reminded all public agencies that they have this responsibility to Native children and to tribes as sovereign nations. Now, many of us, again, in child welfare for a long time will say, we've done a really crappy job with ICWA. And while its intentions might have been good, we really have ignored it blatantly in some states and some jurisdictions, and really have not honored it as well as it should have been. But now comes, I think, 1980 is some of the most important legislation that we've ever had in child welfare, right? Because now we've got Adoption Assistance and Child Welfare Act. This is our Title 4E money, right? And Title 4E, once again, everybody, as soon as we say Title 4E, everybody's alarm bell should go off and be like, that's foster care money, foster care adoption. And look at the time frame, 1980s, war on drugs. I say in air quotes, war on drugs. What was that? That was our concentrated government, whatever attempt to completely try to decimate Black and brown communities, right? Particularly in cities. And at the same time we did that, not accidental, that's when we started to highly fund foster care and adoption, legal family separation, right? 1993, Family Preservation Act, we put some money back in. This is now around, we're talking about crack and AIDS and a recession. There's a little bit of money to quote unquote preserve families. But really all that did was gave us more language of what we called reasonable efforts to make the case of why families should actually be separated. In the 90s, we roll forward and we start to create laws that say, now we can't use terms. We can't use excuses of keeping kids with families who look like them. We want timeframes. Timeframes are more important. We don't care about the trauma to kids. We don't care about the trauma of separation for families. We don't care about the trauma of separation to communities. All we care about are getting kids adopted, right? So MIPA and IEPA start to say, we actually are going to go back to color blindness because we somehow think that color blindness is the way to go, right? Notice this, right? That's what, if you read that language, it's essentially saying that, right? It's the good stuff we thought in the 70s that we've turned into language in the mid 90s to rationalize separating Black and brown families, and most importantly, really destroying Black and brown communities as a result. Adoption and Safe Families Act, to me, is one of the most dangerous, because that's when we start putting timeframes on everything. And then we go back to the real white supremacy dominant culture thinking of everyone, regardless of what they look like, is best off in a white middle-class family, which is basically what the timelines around ASFA are trying to say. It's trying to say, we're going to remove Black and brown kids because we don't believe those are good places to raise kids. And we're going to try to place with white families in really short time frames. And, right, get this, we're going to terminate parental rights. We're going to tell families that they don't have the right to their own children after 12 to 18 months, right? And so, again, I say this, I'm guessing if I could see videos, lots of people would be head shaking and feeling really uncomfortable and sad. But really, this is the system that's been handed to us. So, you know, we look at all this legislation. Again, I go back to language, intent versus impact. Was the intent of any of these policies to be explicitly racist? I can't judge that. Maybe, maybe not. The impact certainly has been incredibly racist. And so the hope, and here's where I go to hope, right? The next slide, for those of you who follow some of the national movements, there's a lot of folks in this country, thankfully, who see that same pattern when we look at our history of legislation and child welfare, including folks at the Center for the Study of Social Policy. Casey Family Programs has been a supporter of this movement. But this notion of upending the child welfare system and creating anti-racist supports for children and family is sort of almost running in parallel to a defund the police movement. And I use the language of their language, upend. They had a great conference last week. If folks want to access their webinar, I'm pretty sure that lots of it was recorded and probably can be listened to. But their notion is about abolition. And it's not saying that abolition is going to be a light switch, right? It doesn't mean that today we have the child welfare system as it is today and tomorrow we don't. It does say that what we need to stop doing is we need to stop pouring more money into child welfare to fix it so we can do what we do better, and instead say we need to actually fund our communities and our families so that the child welfare agency can stop doing what it's doing poorly and actually focus on the very small slice of really serious physical, sexual abuse cases that child welfare maybe has a role in. But all the other stuff, right, that we try to do that we know is better done in communities and by families, we need to find ways to create space to build capacity for that to happen the way it should happen, right? So that families and communities are raising their own. The one thing I didn't say in that history timeline, but I invite you to think about all the time because this is my favorite soapbox, which is even kinship care. Kinship care, which is intended to be so good, right? It's intended to serve our families the way, in a much more natural way, right, that a lot of our families of color raise their children and families. But I ask you to think about this. If in fact we were really supporting families to care for their families the way they choose to care for their families in kinship care arrangements, why do we make them come under child welfare surveillance to do so? Why don't we support those families as intact families with the resources that they need and call that family preservation services if that's what we're doing? And the reason we don't is because we're a white supremacist agency, right? We're a white supremacist system that believes that you have to enter into our surveillance system and our hoops and our scrutiny in order to care for your children the way you know that you want to care for your children. So all of this is the fast forward, Commissioner Jody, Tina, Monica, anything you want to add or correct. That's sort of the 10-minute version of how we ended up where we are and why the change initiatives that we're doing really do need to look across all of these levels. This isn't just about clinical work in the offices or in the regions. This isn't just about the operations side, right? This is every single program and department agency has to be making change initiatives, including those with our partners, because we have a lot of structures and organizational factors that we need to undo and fix.
Yeah, Jen, that's amazing. This is always amazing when I hear it. The only thing I'll definitely add is when I was talking about just an update on some of the change initiatives, I neglected to mention that half of the offices, so out of the 14 offices, 7 of them are focused on the kinship work. And one of the things that we're doing in conjunction with moving our Family First prevention work is really taking a look at how can we support families outside of our system. So I just wanted to share that with the group.
I'll also, this is Jody. First of all, thank you for that incredible presentation. I like Tina every time I hear it, just reflecting on it, having lived that for 31 years, working for the department and watching all that happen. You tell that story from a specific perspective that I think a lot people need to hear it. And I think what you tried to do in that story was open our eyes up to the systemic and structural racism that existed that actually yielded the life that we're living in right now in child welfare. And so we have to open our eyes. We have to open our eyes to see how the structural design of the system on a federal level impacted our work as we interact with kids and families today, and still does that. And so, when we see that, then we can actively start doing something that's different. And what I really wanted to just highlight is that the change initiatives that we're all embarking on, no one gets a pass. So it doesn't matter where you sit in the agency, whether you're talking about, the fiscal, the legal, it's not just our caseload carrying folks that need to change. It's everyone in the department has an obligation to undo whatever contribution the department, the Connecticut Department of Children and Family, is doing to contribute to disproportionality and disparate outcomes for our kids and families.
Yeah, you know, Jody, when you said that, it made me think of one thing that I need to get better at saying, which is I should have given everyone just a moment to sit with this, because, you know, I remember the first time this all started to click for me, that there's a very heavy feeling in my heart, even when I say it out loud, a feeling really complicit, right? That when I entered into the child welfare field in the mid to late 90s, well, actually the mid 90s, I'm kidding myself, and I, you know, I was so well intended, right? And I think about, you know, learning about CAPTA and ASFA and MIPA and IEPA, and all putting my own positive spin on the intention, trying to focus on the intention and losing sight of the potential impact. And when I think back on how many families were negatively impacted and how many communities, it really is a little bit overwhelming, because that wasn't my intent. That wasn't, you know, what drew me to this field. And I hate to think that I was so complicit in it, because, you know, who wants to see themselves as that? And I should give us all pause, because I'm guessing that resonates with everyone, right? We didn't go ahead and enforce ASPA because we were like, ooh, let's you know, right now try to deconstruct Black families all across this country, right? We went in trying to see the best pieces of it to do our best work. And so to me, it's an eye-opener that we just need to be really intentional at looking with that racial justice lens, you know, never taking those glasses off, always putting it through that test. And when there is new legislation, new policy, new directives, that we all check each other, right? Check ourselves, but check each other and have the conversation about what is the impact of this policy, practice, behavior, legislation going to be on our Black and brown families. We have to keep asking those questions in really explicit ways so that we don't end up inadvertently perpetuating what we've got.
Jen, I would also say that, you know, as we think about this as being that kind of structural level, and the focus of what you just shared is from that child welfare perspective, I also don't want us to lose sight of the context of all of those things that were happening in our country along the way, and those public policy influencers like, you know, legalized housing discrimination, zoning laws, the impact to other systems. And as we think about how we are going to try to address our own outcomes, I remind everybody to help the leaders in your respective places across the department continue to refine how we do that within our sphere of influence, because it can be easily overwhelming to say that this is so heavy that there's no way one person, can right the wrongs of history. But we each have a sphere of influence within this child welfare juggernaut that we're a part of that can start to chip away at this from the areas that we represent, and that our perspective is crucial to understand the give and take between all of those systems, and that when we're around the table with our stakeholder groups of other systems, to be able to raise the question about race, or to raise anytime you're given data or statistics about, and you know, from anyone, no longer should it be acceptable that people say we don't keep race or we don't keep those stats. You have to push that from our perspective of representing the child welfare system. So, I also wanted to make sure that folks hear me when I say that we can't pass this off as being too big for us, or that because these a lot of where we are today is influenced by the sheer nature of all of the other systems that we work with, but it's that connection between those systems and challenging the status quo that will help us move as well.
Yeah, and to that point, Commissioner, I would also say, it takes me to what Michael was talking about in terms of thinking about the framework of oppression and liberation, is when we are interacting with families and they do feel like we're racist, they're right. We have to acknowledge that they are living in a very racist world where most of the systems they're interacting with have very similar histories to ours, right, with very racist underpinnings. And so their experience of oppression when they do come to us is very real. And we need to honor that, recognize it, even in our work, including all of us, right, including our staff. So.
Thank you, Jen.
And it's not a tiptoe around it. It really is a consciousness to pay attention to that, because, you know, I would encourage everyone that's on to look closely at our Family First work. It's about identifying candidates for foster care and building up the system outside of DCF, you know, that will prevent that deeper end. You know, we are also looking to transform a lot of our services to our youth and young adults who have been in our care for too long, and they are the products of a system that didn't pay attention to what was happening before the child came into our care. So, you know, sometimes people believe when you focus on prevention that we get soft on safety. It actually sharpens our safety focus. Our net is too wide. We have too many children in foster care. And so when you think about the broader construct of what we're to be here for and to address child maltreatment and child protection, when you look further upstream, you sharpen your safety lens, because we really calibrate the system as a responsive system that we should be.
Beautiful.
Thank you, Commissioner. Michael?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I would want to offer something for consideration, just for people to think on, and particularly Jen, to get your reaction on, in regards to, you know, the slide you presented, which is always powerful to see the historical of a system and how that system intervenes and interacts with cultures differently. What I like to do with those kinds of historical presentations is also look at what was happening in that culture simultaneously in a parallel way, because without that, people can walk away thinking child abuse didn't happen in the Black community at all. Child neglect wasn't a part of our experience prior to a systems involvement. It was always there. There was always abuse. There was always neglect. Black parents there were times where Black parents couldn't care for their kids due to substance abuse, due to mental health, due to domestic violence. All of those things that exist, the majority culture existed in cultures of color. It was how the response to those things occurred in indigenous cultures and in different cultures that's at stake, because right now I fear that people wanting to upend an intervention would lead people to believe that an intervention is no longer necessary, when in fact that is the need for an intervention in communities where children are vulnerable and children are susceptible to being harmed at the hands of their parents. And unfortunately, parents do harm children. That has been a part of our history and a part of our reality. I wish it wasn't. I wish there weren't these horrific events that occurred. Those things happen. It's now about, do we trust communities and communities' interventions to be sufficient that we get behind them and support them? I mean, Black children were being placed in homes of people to raise them that weren't related to them for years. I mean, church members would just say, give me your child, you don't know how to raise them, and just start doing it, you know? That's just been a natural part of our Black culture, particularly for me growing up in the South. Those are just things we did. We went and fed families who didn't have enough to feed their children. We cared for children when parents couldn't do that. When we knew somebody was harming a child in a home, even though there was this code of what goes into my home stays in my home, you know, there were people, men in the church, and particularly deacons and all of those in communities, who would intervene without police and make a difference on behalf of those children that were suffering in the home. Some didn't do it enough because some kids was really harmed, and we have the historical evidence showing that some kids wish there was a system that intervened to get them out of danger from the hands of their families when it occurred. But I truly appreciate the historical analysis of how we got here and what the system did. But I do want to make sure I continuously urge that we also look at the cultural evolution in our Black communities simultaneously, to show that there's still a need for an intervention, but it's about what intervention should that be.
That's absolutely right, Michael. I'm so glad you kind of pulled the thread through that, because I fear sometimes that people leave the conversation to say that, you know, we are asking to leave Black and brown children in unsafe situations, and that is absolutely not the intent. The intent is the equity at which we prescribe or we overlay those risk assessments, and how we then connect families to services that can truly engage them to address some of the issues that were the result of a lot of the public policy that Jen just talked about. So thank you. I hope we're recording that too, because that response has to go along with the presentation that Jen gave, Monica, because I do think that's the constant struggle. You know, when we think about kinship care, a lot of times people would say, well, the commissioner's office said relatives, and it wasn't relatives at all cost. It was applying that equity lens across the table, across the board, so we can make informed decisions, but knowing that the circumstances that a family are in have root causes that we cannot ignore.
Right. And I would just, I would add to that, Michael, I actually love that point too, because I totally agree that child welfare was created, or should be, about safety. And our definition of safety shouldn't have a lot of variation. The problem is that our definition of, our interpretation of safety suddenly starts to get very murky when we bring in race. And we start to, use all of these, code words, right? To say that something we're uncomfortable with is unsafe, as opposed to just saying I'm uncomfortable because I don't know it. So I think there's, two different pieces. One, there's the initial determination, which is always about safety, and that always has to be our North Star. And then there's the, what do you do, right? The intervention, as you pointed out, Michael, that there's no one size fits all, right? The answer to every family isn't foster care, with an unrelated person, right? And so, we have both of those sides. At the end of the day, what child welfare should always have its eye on is safety.
Absolutely, and I appreciate this conversation, and the sweet spot is the both and that we are doing, that we're keeping our eyes on what we need to do in our communities of colors, to empower them to take care of their own. And I appreciated the comment about what if a family had the resources I had as a foster parent, and the support that sort of engulf them, and what impact that might have on the outcomes. So we just can't leave them on their own accord, because we know that there's some work that needs to be done. But the question is, have we done a better job? Let's ask ourselves that question. Right. Are the kids better off in our system? Right. And we know the resounding answer to that is no. And so there has to be a sweet spot where we're doing both. We need to think differently, because our child welfare system, as we know it, child protective system and our child welfare system, should look different if we do this right. And we have to sit with that. What would it look like if we did everything that we were talking about successfully? What then would our agency look like? Would it be smaller? Would it be bigger? What would the families look like that come to us? Yeah. We need to be thinking critically about, and visualize what we want that system to be, and then create the infrastructure around it to make it happen.
Yeah, and Jody, to that point, I don't know what the numbers are in Connecticut, but I do remember, at least within the last couple of years nationally, something like 70% of all children involved with child welfare agencies were involved based on reasons of neglect or related to neglect. And so that, to me, is a major alarm bell, right? Because why do you need a child welfare? Why do you need a major government surveillance institution to be involved in your family's life when it's an issue of need?
And that then poses the question for us from just a public policy perspective, is that when we see children are being neglected based on need in families, and government is not the answer, then what is? And what should we be advocating for to intervene with families so that the neglect situation children are facing can go away? I mean, we know children live in poverty, which should not exist in a country like this. And we know children are in neglectful situations, which should not exist. And so that's always my head scratcher, is like, okay, if it's not a government agency that intervenes, if not public sector government's responsibility to intervene in the lives of families when they're struggling, and based on their struggles and challenge, children are neglected, what is the solution? Because we can't, I couldn't walk away from that circumstance and just say, let the children suffer in their neglectful situation. That's just something that I couldn't do.
So Michael, I would love to hear from others in the group as well. My first instinct when you asked that question is, we need to ask communities what they want and what they need. And we can't be the ones, part of the government thing is, we can't be the ones sitting inside,
That's right.
deciding what it is that families and communities need. This is where our family engagement comes in. We need to walk side by side. It's solidarity, right, in all levels of understanding what do communities want. I'm pretty sure most of them don't want us.